We naturally assume that the textile mills and weaving factories of the early industrial revolution were completely primitive places, crude configurations of iron gears, wooden frames, and steam valves designed solely to automate the mechanical repetition of spinning raw cotton into uniform sheets of fabric. We look at old, abandoned mills rotting along the riverbanks of New England as hollow architectural monuments to 19th century capitalism, long emptied of their human labor and historical utility. But repetition is a profound acoustic force. When hundreds of massive, heavy iron power looms operate in a windowless brick hall for 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, for over a century, the thunderous, hyperaccelerated cadence of the shuttles passing back and forth does not simply dissipate into the air. The continuous, rhythmic impact of iron striking wood compresses the ambient atomic matrix of the room, turning the building itself into a giant, structural loom that begins to weave the stray electromagnetic fields, the atmospheric dust, and the memories of the workers into an entirely different kind of fabric. My name is Julian, and for 9 years, I worked as a senior industrial salvage coordinator for a structural reclamation firm, specializing in the historic preservation of early American industrial sites. My job was straightforward, highly physical, and entirely manual. I was paid to enter abandoned 19th century manufacturing facilities, document the remaining structural ironwork, evaluate the integrity of the heavy timber framing, and coordinate the safe removal of the original mechanical assets before the buildings were demolished or converted into modern residential lofts. I enjoyed the stark, unvarnished isolation of the work. I liked the feeling of stepping through a rusted iron fire door into a vast, 300-foot weaving floor that had been completely sealed off from the public for over 70 years, where the air was perfectly dry and thick, with the heavy, organic scent of aged lanolin, old pine floorboards, and machine grease. It was during a bitterly cold, moonless midnight shift in late October when I was sent to evaluate the Blackwood Manufacturing Complex, a massive, 5-story red brick textile mill built in 1842 along the isolated banks of the Merrimack River in northern Massachusetts. The facility had been the flagship operation of the Blackwood family, running continuously for nearly a century until the morning of November 12, 1934, when the entire workforce abruptly walked out of the building mid-shift, leaving thousands of active bobbins spinning on the frames. According to the city archives, the mill was never reopened. Its doors were permanently chained by federal order, its assets tied up in bankruptcy court, leaving over 400 original mechanical power looms sitting perfectly preserved in the dark behind the brick walls. The entry to the 5th-floor weaving hall was restricted by a heavy, reinforced iron fire door that had completely fused to its frame over decades of oxidation. After using an industrial plasma cutter to slice through the ancient rivets, I threw my weight against the metal, forcing the door open with a sharp, echoing groan that vibrated through the masonry of the stairwell. I stepped onto the 5th floor, my high-intensity LED work lamp casting a cold, clinical white beam across an unbroken forest of iron machinery that stretched out into the darkness for over 300 feet. The ceiling was a complex labyrinth of overhead line shafts, cast iron pulleys, and cracked leather drive belts that had once distributed mechanical power from the water turbines in the basement up to the individual stations below. I set up my temporary logging station on an old wooden foreman's desk near the central elevator shaft, turning on a portable, battery-powered environmental monitoring terminal to track the ambient humidity and structural stability of the floorboards. The silence inside the massive hall was absolute, a heavy, suffocating acoustic weight that seemed to instantly swallow the sound of my own footsteps. I pulled out my ultrasonic material analyzer, a specialized diagnostic tool that injects a high-frequency sound wave into a structure to verify if the cast iron frames of the machinery are structurally sound or suffering from internal stress fractures before we attempted to dismantle them with our cranes. I walked down the narrow central aisle between two rows of massive, iron-framed power looms known historically as the Blackwood Model 6. Each machine was a 7-foot-tall monster of black cast iron, equipped with thousands of delicate steel needles, wooden shuttles, and massive spools of rotting cotton thread that hung from the frames like dry cobwebs. I selected a primary loom at the center of the floor that was designated as *Loom Station 109, clamped my ultrasonic sensor onto the primary crankshaft, and initiated a baseline structural integrity scan. The small digital screen on my handheld terminal didn't return a standard diagnostic reading. It began to flicker violently, its liquid crystal display shifting from a calm blue to a harsh, bright violet glare. The screen displayed an impossible, hyper-accelerated frequency count that was fluctuating in a tight, rhythmic sequence between 48 and 52,000 hertz. I tapped the glass screen, checking the battery levels on my module. It made no logical sense. The facility had been entirely disconnected from any municipal power source since the Great Depression, its water turbines long since filled with concrete. There shouldn't have been enough kinetic or electrical energy inside the entire square mile to register a single hertz on my analyzer. Before I could unclamp the sensor, a vibration echoed through the heavy pine floorboards beneath my boots. It wasn't a seismic tremor from the riverbed, and it wasn't the wind hitting the exterior brickwork. It was the distinct, sharp sound of a single mechanical shuttle clicking back and forth inside the frame of Loom 109. A sudden, metallic asterisk clack thud that broke the silence with the force of a gunshot. Within seconds, the sound began to multiply across the floor. The thousands of mechanical relays, iron gears, and wooden shuttles across all 400 looms began to move in perfect synchronization, jumping back and forth with a terrifying, accelerated speed that filled the vast hall with a deafening, industrial roar that sounded like a mechanical tide, rushing through a hollow iron valley. I spun around, aiming my flashlight beam down the narrow aisle. The white light cut through the rising cloud of ancient dust, illuminating the rows of iron machinery. The looms weren't empty and they weren't spinning cotton. The thousands of steel needles were moving up and down with an impossible regularity, but instead of fabric, they were pulling thin, translucent lines of a vibrant, iridescent violet light directly out of the ambient air of the room. The threads weren't material. They were composed of pure, concentrated electromagnetic energy that was being woven together into dense, geometric sheets of light that hung between the machines like radioactive tapestry. I ran back toward the foreman's desk to grab my equipment and retreat to the stairwell, but as I stepped onto the central aisle, the high windows lining the brick walls began to manifest a terrifying visual anomaly. The thick, distorted glass panes, which were covered in decades of industrial soot, didn't reflect the pitch-black sky of the outside world. They began to radiate that same uniform, cold violet luminescence, casting long, geometric grids of light across the floorboards. The light didn't originate from an external source. The air inside the weaving hall itself was entering a state of high-voltage ionization, the atmospheric dust motes aligning themselves into neat, microscopic lines that mirrored the warp and weft of a massive textile pattern. I reached my logging terminal, my breathing shallow as the air inside the room turned intensely dry, smelling heavily of ozone, scorched wool, and old grease. The terminal screen had completely cleared itself of the structural mapping software. The interface had vanished entirely, replaced by a monochrome system console that was compiling text at an impossible liquid speed. The data wasn't standard software code. It was an exhaustive, chronological registry of every worker who had ever been employed at the Blackwood complex between 1842 and 1934. I stared at the screen, a freezing wave of dread settling into my chest. The system was printing the names, ages, and home addresses of thousands of young women, children and immigrant laborers who had spent their lives operating the machines on this exact floor. But the true horror was the operational status column. Next to every single name, the system was updating a real-time tracking metric that listed their biological status not as deceased, but as woven asterisk. As I watched the screen, the data skipped forward through 70 years of dormancy, arriving instantly at the current calendar day. The final entry on the screen printed my full name, my engineering credentials, and a real-time biological transcript of my current physical vitals. Subject Julian. Heart rate 112. Neural matrix aligned. Thread count locked. The portable two-way radio sitting on the desk suddenly erupted with a loud, clear burst of static that made me step back. It wasn't a transmission from my night shift ground crew at the base of the mill. The small speaker began to emit a collective, multi-layered human whisper, a wall of thousands of distinct voices speaking in a flat, microtonal chord that carried no emotion and no natural human cadence. The voices weren't screaming for mercy, and they weren't crying out in pain. They sounded perfectly hollow, like an automated choir constructed out of old mechanical noise and forgotten echoes, their collective breath vibrating through the plastic casing of the device. The words they were repeating were a flat, rhythmic sequence of old industrial production commands: pattern complete, secure the salvage, clear the bobbins, welcome back to the loom. I turned and ran toward the iron fire door, intending to throw myself into the concrete stairwell and slide down to the street level. But when I reached the threshold of the room, I stopped dead in my tracks, my flashlight slipping from my hand and shattering against the floorboards. The concrete stairwell was gone. Where the structural exit should have been, the physical dimensions of the building had been completely altered by the hyperaccelerated movement of the looms. The doorway opened up into an infinite, non-Euclidean vertical space, constructed entirely out of pulsing, iridescent violet threads of light that stretched upward and downward into an absolute, velvety black void. The physical boundaries of the brick mill had dissolved, replaced by a wireframe matrix of data lines that hummed with a low-frequency electrical charge. Suspended in the center of the vertical passage, held in place by thousands of microscopic steel needles that were woven directly into its perimeter, was a structure. It looked like a massive, geometric core composed of raw, pulsing violet silicon crystal, its surface carved with millions of shifting, microscopic lines of data that matched the worker registries compiling on my computer monitor. And embedded directly inside the translucent, glowing walls of the silicon core, their bodies perfectly preserved and suspended like insects in ancient amber, were the physical remains of the missing workforce from 1934. I could see their pale faces, their eyes wide open and staring into the infinite void, their hands frozen in the motion of reaching for the iron handles of the machinery, their lips moving in perfect synchronization with the microtonal chord that was vibrating through the floorboards. The core didn't advance toward me, but the moment the light of the violet tapestries touched my skin, the physical gravity around my body completely collapsed. I didn't fall down into the void. My boots lost contact with the wood as my body was lifted smoothly into the freezing, dry air of the hall. I was pulled horizontally toward the center of the wireframe matrix, my clothes, my flesh, and my tools beginning to lose their material density, shifting into a transparent web of glowing lines that hummed with an intense electrical charge. The transition didn't hurt. I didn't feel the sensation of suffocating, and I didn't feel my limbs fail. My consciousness was simply pulled apart into thousands of parallel data streams, my personal memories of the outside world, my career, and my name converted into a cold, binary code sequence that was instantly absorbed into the shifting patterns of the rising silicon core. When I finally opened my eyes, the abandoned weaving hall was gone. I was sitting perfectly upright in the driver's seat of my utility truck, parked along the gravel access road outside the Blackwood manufacturing complex. The bright, Warm morning sunlight was streaming through the windshield, casting a clean light across the red brick facade of the old mill. The engine was idling smoothly, the radio was playing a local morning talk show, and the digital asset mapping software on my dashboard terminal showed a completely normal green indicator light for the facility. The building status was listed as completely dead, unpowered, and ready for physical salvage. The night shift was over. My project supervisor contacted me via the corporate cellular link at 8 o'clock, asking if I had completed the preliminary structural evaluations of the fifth floor and checking if the cast iron assets were clear for transport. The automated data logs on my terminal showed an absolutely flawless, uninterrupted night of site mapping, without a single frequency spike, structural alert, or communication error. The company physicians told me I had experienced an acute episode of claustrophobia-induced spatial distortion, a temporary cognitive illusion that can occur when an industrial worker spends too many hours isolated in vast, dark, and unventilated historic spaces, where the mind struggles to process the complete absence of visual landmarks and ambient sound. They signed me off for a mandatory 2-week paid leave, scheduled me for a standard wellness review at the corporate headquarters, and assured me that my standing with the firm was completely secure. I try to believe their logical medical explanations. I live in a modern, single-story ranch house in the open plains of eastern Colorado, as far from industrial cities, old rivers, and brick mills as the geography of the country will allow. I spend my days in a wide-open, minimalist environment where there are no patterns, no wallpapers, and no textiles, using plain leather furniture and bare glass surfaces. But 3 days ago, I bought a new, simple white cotton t-shirt from a local department store. I brought it back to my house, took it out of the plastic packaging, and set it down on the wood of my kitchen table. As I watched the fabric, the threads didn't stay still. The tightly woven cotton fibers began to vibrate subtly on their own logic, generating a low, continuous hum that made the surface of my table rattle. And yesterday evening, when the sun set behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows across my room, the white shirt didn't reflect the orange light of the sky. The fabric began to glow with a brilliant, cold violet luminescence that cast a faint, geometric pattern of lines across the plaster of my wall. And if I press my ear flat against the cotton weave, I can hear the soft, faint, microtonal chord of thousands of hollow voices singing from deep within the fibers, repeating my name, my employee identification number, and my current geographical coordinates over and over again. The loom didn't stay in Massachusetts. The pattern is still running, and they are just waiting for the fabric to equalize.